It's wonderful to be with you for the third session of Sharing Christ. This is Sharing the Journey. And in the first session, we heard Dave speak to us about the call that all of us receive from the Lord to go out and to share and to proclaim the good news. And in our second session, we kind of asked the question, well, how do I share it? And the answer was, in a way that's probably simpler than you might think. It's through friendships and through relationships that we begin to share that good news. What we want to look at in this session, based on that, is really ask the question, well, when I share it in friendships and in relationships, what words do I use? And the answer, very simply, as will unfold in this talk, is you use the words of your own story. That's what we're going to focus on in this third session. Now, we want to begin with this truth. Every single one of us, all of us, has a story. Pope Paul VI said, in the long run, is there any other way of handing on the gospel than by transmitting to another person one's personal experience of faith? So we begin with this truth. Each and every one of us has a story. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, others have a story, but not me. So right off the bat, let's just make sure that we're all clear on that. We do, in fact, all have a story to share because the Lord, in His love for us, is at work in our life. And the fact that He's at work in our life, wanting to save us, means we have a story. Our story is simply all of those things that the Lord has been doing in our life to bring about our salvation. So we all have a story. Now, each of our stories is unique and different. The Lord never, ever likes to use cookie cutters. And so we want to recognize that there are differences. So, for example, take two of the great saints that we have, St. Augustine and St. Therese of Lisieux. Radically different stories. St. Augustine, we know in his youth, was a man with a tremendously restless heart. Augustine was searching for meaning and purpose in life. But not only was his heart restless, but he had a restless mind. He was a man searching for truth, and he went from one philosophy to another. But he also had a very restless body. We know the story of his mistress and the child out of wedlock. All of that moving toward this great and dramatic moment of his conversion. Now compare that to someone like St. Therese. At a very young age, she enters the Carmelite convent, leads a very hidden life in the convent, dies at the age of 24, and it was to St. Therese that her spiritual director once said, in my opinion, you have never committed a mortal sin. I don't think anyone could have said that to St. Augustine. So all of our stories are different, and yet notice how the Lord makes use of such radically different stories. So we want to feel comfortable fitting in to this beautiful span of stories that the Lord has in and among His church. Now, when we look at the saints, we might be tempted to think, well, okay, maybe I have a story, but mine is not nearly as dramatic as someone like St. Augustine. So we want to also make the point that in regard to our story, drama is not absolutely necessary in the sense that we need to have some radical story like St. Augustine. Because again, we look at St. Therese and we realize how powerfully the Lord can use what would appear to have been a very simple, ordinary, and hidden life. So we all have that story, and the story's different. And there may be dramatic moments, there may be very simple, gentle moments. But the way that the Lord works, every single part of our life is part of that story. And the Lord makes use of all of those different aspects of our life in order to draw others to Himself. And we're going to see and hear in this talk how that happens as this unfolds for us. So we all have a story. Now, how do we come to know what that story is? Well, to get to know our story, we can ask ourselves just four very basic questions. What was my life like before I met the Lord Jesus? How did I realize that I needed Him? And then, how did I commit my life to the Lord? And then finally, what difference has Jesus made in my life? These four questions can lead us to an appreciation of just what our own story is. So for myself, what was my life like before I met Jesus? Well, I can look back, and it was a very typical college life. That was my life before I met the Lord. A very typical college life that led to a heart that was desiring more, that was thinking there's got to be more to life than just this. And that then becomes the answer to the second question. Well, how did I realize I needed him? Well, for me, I realized I needed him because my heart was beginning to not be satisfied with those things that early in college were they seemed fun and exciting, but as college went on, those things just seemed to be emptied of any real meaning or joy. How did I commit my life to the Lord? Well, that happened in a wonderful way, in part through the young adults that I got to be part of as my conversion was unfolding. And I learned how to give my life to the Lord just based on what I saw my young adult friends doing. I kind of imitated what I saw them doing in terms of how they prayed and how they were being disciples of the Lord. But there was also a dramatic moment of realizing I couldn't sit on the fence and had to make a very firm decision, either for or against the Lord. What difference has Jesus made in my life? Well, probably the collar is the greatest giveaway on that. But this truly is the difference he made in entering into my life and very beautifully, radically changing the course and the direction of my life. I'm now in the place where very happily I get to serve him as one of his priests. So these are the questions that we want to ask ourselves when we reflect and we say, well, what is my story? I believe I have one. So what exactly is my story? So we want to begin with those 4 questions. Now, as you reflect on that, either in prayer or as you're talking with friends, as you're reflecting on those questions, it can be helpful to begin to commit our story to writing, really for 2 main reasons. One, in writing it down, we take more ownership of it. We are affirming, Lord, this is what you've been doing in my life. And that's a good thing for us to be able to take ownership of it, to be able to say and declare, Lord, I know what you've been doing in my life. But there's another benefit that comes from it as well. Writing it down also helps us to commit those memories or those details to our memory. Otherwise, they might slip away as time goes on. An example in Scripture of this is the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms really is kind of the living memory of God's people, reminding them and keeping before them the great deeds that the Lord had done, lest they forget. Well, the Lord does not want you to forget what he's done and accomplished in your life. He wants you to appreciate it so deeply in your heart that you're ready to share it with others. So putting it down in writing can be a great way of committing it to memory, lest those details slip as time goes on. Now, as you reflect on your story, it's also good to remember and to know that your story does not encompass only that one area of your life where you first gave your life to the Lord. In fact, it really is always continually unfolding. God is never done with you. He's never done with you. So the 4 elements, those 4 questions that we just looked at, those are going to keep repeating themselves throughout your life. The image here would be kind of like the onion that's always having those layers peeled off one by one by one. The Lord is never done with you, always at work in you. A beautiful example of this from Scripture is St. Peter. St. Peter had multiple conversions. We think of that first call on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, but it wasn't limited to just that moment. We know the story of Peter, how there were many times when Peter kind of wrestled with things, and very dramatically at the end, when he denied the Lord Jesus 3 times. And then after the Lord was raised from the dead, the Lord Jesus asked Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Calling him back again to himself. But Peter's story was not just that one first moment of being called away from the nets on the shore, but it encompassed all of those other moments that the Lord was calling him closer and closer to himself. Our conversion is not just a one-time thing, but it continually unfolds. And it's important to keep that in mind as we think about our story. So that unfolding story, that deepening, is revealed in some other questions that we can ask ourselves. We can ask, well, what has God taught me from failure? What has God taught me from a lack of money? What has He taught me from an experience of sorrow or depression? These are questions that we can look at in our own life and realize how in those moments the Lord was calling us and drawing us closer to Himself. Other questions. What has God taught me through waiting, through illness, through disappointment? This idea of this deepening conversion that we have, it strikes me because I think back to my first year in the seminary in Rome. And that first year, going over, all of the classes at the university were taught in Italian. And I went over not having studied any Italian at all. And sitting in class and not understanding anything really, it seemed, through that first semester, and that first semester turned into a second semester, the sense of a loss of control over my life was so dramatic. To sit in class and to not feel like you're understanding the stuff that you're supposed to be learning in order to be a good priest. A classmate of mine said, I feel like a dog watching television. I kind of sit in class and cock my head. I know that he's saying something, but I don't know what he's saying. And that was the experience in a funny way, but in a painful way, it was this dramatic sense of a loss of control. But I'll tell you what, I grew more that year, perhaps, than any other year up to that point. So I look back and I can see clearly that first conversion I had, but I look to that first year of seminary in Rome, and I look back and I say, Lord, as painful as it was, you were doing so much in me through that experience of not having the control I was used to having. So that's part of my story as well, is what the Lord did in that time of trial, that first year. So we want to ask ourselves those other questions to really get a sense of the whole, full, big picture of our story with the Lord. Now, with all of this, we also want to take time for prayer and reflection. These are the kind of things that we want the Lord to stir up in our hearts when we're sitting with Him in prayer, letting Him remind us of what He has done and of what He is doing in our life. That allows us, again, to kind of take more ownership of what it is that He's doing. Also, our spiritual friendships, good spiritual conversations with others are a great way of coming to know our story, where just in the course of a conversation with a close friend who shares a relationship with the Lord, something they say can trigger a thought of, wow, you know what, the Lord's been doing that in me as well. Or, wow, I've had a different experience than that. But these are ways that we come to really appreciate and come to know the story that is ours as the Lord is at work within our life. Okay, so we've all got a story, and we need and we want to spend time coming to know that story. Well, as you come to know it, then we look at the next step when we actually begin to share that story in those friendships and those relationships that we heard mentioned in session 2. When we get ready to do that, this first rule is really incredibly important: to make a friend before we make a convert. What I mean is this: when we're out sharing our story with others in those friendships and those relationships, we want to make sure that our first goal, our first aim always is to love those people that the Lord has put into our life. That we're not looking to simply kind of go out and get one convert after another so that we can go home and on our chalkboard put up another mark there and count them all up. Rather, when we're sharing our story with others, the first goal simply is to love them. We're sharing our story because we love them and we want them to come to know what the Lord might be doing in their own life and may want to be doing in their life. So it's not about success, but about love, about wanting and desiring the good of the other before all else. So to make a friend before we make a convert. I think of an example from my ministry as a priest. Several years ago, I had a funeral for an adult whose mom and dad were still living. And the funeral, as you can imagine, was a painful funeral, painful any time that a parent, regardless of the age, has to bury a child. And so after the funeral mass, we went out to the cemetery, we had the burial, and the family invited people back to their home. So I joined them back at their house. Now, I'd ridden with them out to the cemetery, and so I rode with them back to the home. And at the end of the time at the home, just that little bit of time of fellowship, the father had said, well, when you're ready to go back to the parish, just let me know, I'll drive you back there. Well, I knew that the father had not been going to church. Something had happened at some other point in his life where he had fallen away. And I don't know what it was, but all I knew was that he was not active in practicing his faith. And here he is now dealing with the death of his daughter. And so in the midst of all of that, I just wanted to be there with him and for him. So they lived about maybe 15 minutes from the parish. So in the course of the drive back, 15 minutes is all it was, but my desire was just to be there with him. That was it. And I do not even remember the conversation that we had driving from their home back to the parish. But we talked for about 15 minutes, we got back there, and at the end he drops me off, and I told him, I'll keep praying for you, and that was it. Well, what may have been maybe 6 months later or so, I'm not sure, maybe even a year, I saw him at a parish event, and I knew I'd started to see him coming to Mass. Well, at this parish event, he grabbed me and pulled me off to the side, and he said, Father, I want you to know that you're the reason why I started coming back to Mass. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm trying to keep my face straight, but I'm thinking to myself, I don't even really know what it is that I said to him. But I do know this. If I had tried to come up with the perfect 15-minute conversation to bring him back to the Lord, it would have been a complete failure. So what the Lord did in a good way was just at some point said to me, don't try to come up with the perfect conversation, just be there for him. And the Lord just got in there and did what he needed to do. So I think about that when we reflect on this first step, that when we go out to share our story, we always want to be motivated first and foremost by love, not by a desire to win the person and chalk up another convert, for ourselves. It's always a matter first of making a friend before a convert. Another thing is simply be yourself. When you start to share with others what the Lord has been doing in your life, what you want to do is share it in a way that's you just being who you are. Because if there's one thing that our world is really looking for and is keyed in on, is this sense of authenticity. If you speak from your heart and you're just being yourself, people are going to know that. And there's so much fake in our world that as soon as someone begins to perceive that what you're saying isn't really who you are, then we get turned off that way. So we want to be ourselves. So what does that look like? What does it look like when you're just you sharing your story, what God has been doing in your life with others? I want to give you a chance to hear now the testimony of Juan as he shares just what the Lord did for him and how he, in the course of his life, was given opportunities to share that with others, not becoming someone else, but simply being who the Lord made him to be.
I was raised Catholic. I would say lukewarm Catholic. My family wanted to go to Mass every Sunday, but it was okay if we didn't make it. Then I went through the sacrament of confirmation, after which I moved away from the faith. And it wasn't until back in 2007, my last year of college, that I had a personal encounter with God, and that completely transformed me and my relationship to the world. And one of the things that I had to face was the response to Jesus' commandment of the Great Commission, that is to evangelize. Back in 2011, I celebrated a big milestone in my life, and I called it the Celebration of Life event. Basically, when I was 21 years old, I was diagnosed with cancer. So this was my being cancer-free for 5 years celebration. Invited tons of people, family, friends, co-workers, people from all areas of my life. And in the event, one of the things that I decided to do was to share the gospel in front of people while I was giving a talk about cancer, etc. And when I did that part, not everybody was happy or comfortable with it. But I feel so indebted that, some came to me and thanked me, and most people there weren't followers of Christ. And you could tell by the way they approached me that they had been impacted and heard something that they couldn't really explain. So it's something that I'm glad I did, and it wasn't easy at all to share with this kind of people. 2 years ago, I was traveling in Thailand, and I befriended this young lady from India. And I remember as we were on a small wooden raft on a river about 100 miles west of Bangkok, we just got into conversation about God, and I just shared my personal experience, what I've learned, what impact it's had in my life to know Jesus. And it wasn't a theological discussion. I mean, questions came up that I didn't have the answer to. It was an honest, authentic, heartfelt conversation with another human being. And a few months later, she wrote me an email, which I will read a part of. I feel really indebted to you for sharing your love of God with me. I've had a real yearning grow in me since I returned. I've been trying to find myself, and I've realized that the only way I can do that and feel love in all its fullness is by reconnecting with God. I've done lots of soul searching, and He has brought to the surface so much guilt and hurt and anger. But in the process of trying to let go, He's found me. I've never felt closer or more intimate with God in my entire life. Amen.
What a beautiful testimony that is, and how great it is to be reminded of how powerfully the Lord can work when we simply share with others what He's been doing in our own life, and how great it is that the Lord brings about those situations where simply and authentically sharing what the Lord's been doing, how other lives are touched. That's what this is all about. Let's build on that a little bit, again, as we think about those moments that we will have to share our story with others. A few pointers here. As we're sharing our stories with others, keep it simple. Meaning, there's no need to use really high and lofty Christian vocabulary. We don't need to do it. At the end of my second year of studies in Rome, I actually did learn a little bit of Italian. And at the end of the second year, the seminarians go back home, they spend a summer in a parish, and then return back again for their third year of theology. So at the end of that summer, I fly back to Rome, and I took a train from the airport out to the main train station in Rome, and then jumped in a taxi to go from the train station over to the seminary. So in the taxi along the way, the taxi driver knows that he's taking me to the American seminary, so he asks me in Italian, well, why did you want to become a priest? So my Italian was okay, but it was not strong by any means. And so I was forced, just because of my very basic Italian, to try to share with him in a very simple way, without any big vocabulary, because I didn't know any, to share with him why it was that I was here in Rome studying to be a priest. So I shared with him as best as I could with the simple words that I was able to share. Now, I think for the ears of the Italian taxi driver, it probably sounded something like Tarzan. It was probably something like heart empty, heart want more, Jesus, give more, ooh. And I think, really, that's probably what it sounded like to him. I couldn't do any more than that. But there's a lesson in that oftentimes keeping it simple really is best, because someone who does not yet know the Lord is not going to appreciate high Christian vocabulary. We want to meet them where they are. So keeping it simple in that way. Another really important point is this, that as we're sharing our story, we trust in the Lord that He's the one who interiorly, in the heart and the mind of the one that we're talking with, is going to bring about the transformation. He's going to bring about the conversion. So He converts, not us. So our role is simply to witness to what He's done in our life. That's the extent of our role. Listen to how Rick Warren puts it. He says, this is the essence of witnessing. Simply sharing your personal experiences regarding the Lord. In a courtroom, a witness is not expected to argue the case, prove the truth, or press for a verdict. That is the job of attorneys. Witnesses simply report what has happened. You may not be a Bible scholar, but you are an authority on your own life. And it's hard to argue with personal experience. In truth, he says, your personal testimony is more effective than a sermon because unbelievers see pastors as professional salesmen, but see you as a satisfied customer, so they give you more credibility. So that's our role, to simply bear witness to what God has done in our own life. That's why coming to know our story is so important. But the interior work of actually bringing about the conversion, that doesn't rest on us. That's the work of God. So we have the freedom here to simply share the story that God has been accomplishing in our own life with others. Here's another point. As we're doing this, an approach would be to consider all of this much more fishing rather than hunting. Hunting has more of kind of a violent approach to it in the sense that when you're hunting, you are out, you're stalking, you're pursuing, you're going after. In regard to this work of sharing the Lord with others, we want to think of it much more like fishing, where there is a patience and there's a desire not to go out and pounce on, but to attract and draw. A priest who spoke to a convocation of priests in the diocese at one time, he was sharing his own experience, and he was just a very normal, ordinary priest. And he had said he kind of, at times, struggled with just his own, who he was, and, Lord, do I have everything that, that I need to have in order to be out there to be your effective priest? And he said that he finally was at peace when he realized that whether or not he liked it, he was the worm that God had put on the hook and was casting out. And once he realized that the Lord wanted to use him as he was, as that worm, then there was a much greater freedom, and he was able to relax in that role, seeing himself as the worm on God's hook. It's a beautiful image because it says that the Lord wants to use you as He's made you. And again, it's not a matter of going out and stalking and setting up traps, but simply more like the fishing. Lord, be at work through me. Make my life attractive enough that it will draw others to you. Another point here, be open to the opportunities that God gives you when that conversation might open up. Recognize when someone is hungry for the Lord. And this goes back to the point that we heard in session 2. Be open to letting those friendships and those relationships develop. So you're at the office and you're taking a break and there's someone there at the coffee pot with you. And the normal, regular office conversation is, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? Just great. And you get your coffee and you go back to your cubicle and you go back to work. Well, what happens on a day when you say to someone very casually, oh, how you doing? And they say to you, not so good. Are you attentive enough at that moment to realize that someone has just opened the door for you? That that's not the normal response we get, but rather that's the response of, I've got a lot going on inside and I would love to be able to talk about it. Are we open enough at that moment to realize that God is granting us an opportunity? And then to perceive it and then to follow on with it, to say, really, well, what's going on? We want to be open to those opportunities that the Lord gives to us, to recognize those moments when someone is expressing their hunger for something more. those moments, we don't want to let them pass by without recognizing it. So we pray that the Lord will give us the chance to do that. Another point is this, that we don't want to stand on the sidelines waiting in order to get all of this down perfectly within us and then launch into it. Rather, practice makes perfect. Don't stay on the sidelines waiting for that perfect opportunity. Simply wade out into this and let the Lord teach you as you go. That's the best way. Again, the disciples in the gospel are a perfect model of this. They didn't have it down perfectly. There's that old saying that the Lord cleans his fish after he catches them. And it's not up to us to make ourselves perfect and then launch into it. We need to leave room for the Lord here. And so rather than waiting for perfection, we simply step out knowing that the more that we do it, the more comfortable we get with it, the better we're going to do with it. I know I would not be here had it not been for those in my life who stepped out and shared what God had done for them in turn with me. And so this is what the Lord wants to do in and through each of us. And it begins not by trying to have to learn something completely foreign to us, but simply sharing what we know best, what God has done and is doing in our own life. Your story shared with others has power, and the Lord wants to make use of that to draw others into his kingdom, that others might come to know and experience the love that you have experienced from him.